Oh, I found my way back to the Great Hall. And I finally found my way up here. Like, I was trying to find my way up to this path early. What the freak? How am I back down here? No, really, how did I fall through the floor there? It's like... Okay, there's gotta be something going on. Let's take a look here. Looks fine over there. Oh, you have gotta be freaking kidding me. That tiny little gap, I somehow fell through a hole that small? My body must be paper thin or something. I mean, this isn't the only spot in the game like this. There's other spots where you shouldn't physically be capable of fitting through, yet somehow can. Now here's an ancient DOS game that definitely helps to prove that a game can still be fun even when the graphics consist of the lowest vertex counts you can possibly imagine. That game being Castle Master. To call the graphics in this game dated would be a bit of an understatement, especially considering it came out at a time when more advanced 3D graphics were already well on their way. But what this game lacks in graphical fidelity, it more than makes up for in terms of just how much stuff there is to see and places to explore. Truth be told though, there's not really a lot to say about this game, nor would I want to spoil too much of it since the whole nature of this game revolves around exploring this huge castle while solving environmental puzzles. There are a number of battles as the game progresses, but they primarily just amount to slowly taking damage while throwing rocks at your attackers until they die. Now, those of you aware of old 3D engines may feel there's something familiar going on here too, and there's a reason for that. This game is built upon a special 3D engine called Freescape, used in a number of releases made by the developers of this game to produce what, at the time, constituted as surprisingly well-detailed full 3D environments. The pace of technology made Freescape obsolete pretty quickly, but it would be many years before full 3D environments would once again hit the scene, since for most of the early 90s, developers would take all kinds of shortcuts towards 3D visuals, such as using sprites or by raycasting 2D maps, as opposed to going with objects and environments that had fully realized three-dimensional shapes. Castle Master was developed by Incentive Software and published by Domark Software in 1990. It's a one-player 3D adventure game supporting the typical quad of late 80s video modes: Hercules 2-color, CGA 4-color, Tandy 16-color, and EGA 16-color graphics, with all but the Hercules mode running at 320 by 200 resolution. The Tandy and EGA modes look identical, and since the only audio support is for the PC speaker, it doesn't matter which you go with for the purposes of emulation. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, and while Castle Master isn't too difficult to find for other computer systems, the DOS version is very tricky to come across and typically pretty expensive when you do run into it, running around $25 to $50 for a fully boxed copy. Unless you're specifically trying to collect the DOS version, it may be better off to go with a version for another system if you want to try this game for yourself, since the Amiga, Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum versions of this game are all substantially cheaper and easier to find. There's also releases for the Amstrad CPC and the Atari ST, but they're just as rare as the DOS version and likely to be similarly priced. When you start the game, you have a choice between playing as the prince or the princess. Really, as far as I can tell, there's virtually no difference between the two, save for which bathroom stall you're allowed to use once you find that particular room in the castle. Now, some versions of the game will then proceed to have the opposite character kidnapped and brought to the castle, where your goal is to rescue them. And that's still the goal in the DOS version, except it doesn't really make it apparent that that's what you're trying to do. In order to actually make it into the castle grounds, you have to quickly learn the controls. And while the controls are, quite frankly, really convoluted, you can thankfully get around well enough using the arrow keys for basic movement and the mouse for everything else. Many of the keyboard-based controls have mouse-driven shortcuts on screen, such as the eye indicator, which can be clicked on to look up, look down, and recenter your view, plus the windows on the castle tower on the left side of the screen act to change your movement mode between run, walk, and crawl. You also have two other controls of extreme importance, the ability to interact with objects and the ability to throw rocks. Now, unlike a lot of adventure games where you're not really able to interact with things that are inconsequential, you may be surprised just how interactive some of the environment can be here, to the point where if touching a particular object would be a really bad idea in real life, then you probably don't want to do it here either, such as touching the flames of torches and candles. Throwing rocks, on the other hand, is how you'll not only defend yourself, but also how you'll knock things loose, such as padlocks and treasures stuck in holes. About halfway through the game, you'll also find a potion which will permanently allow you to teleport to various doorways simply by tossing rocks at them, though some doorways are magically guarded to prevent you from doing this. As for the indicators on the screen, there's three you're going to want to track at all times: your strength, the strength of the castle's spirits, and your keys. Your strength is represented by a set of dumbbells, and while this stat primarily acts as your health, it also affects how well you can interact with the environment around you when related to feats of strength, such as pushing heavy objects or just moving around in general. Certain objects simply won't budge if your strength isn't high enough, and if you get really weak, you'll fall to the ground and won't even be able to stand up straight. There are various ways to restore your strength as you travel around, including eating food and drinking drinks. The drinks in this game are alcoholic though, so if you have too many within too short a period of time, you'll lose strength instead of gaining it. There's also a dumbbell you can find much later in, which can power up your strength by using it. Basically though, if you run out of strength, the game ends. The little green tube with the air bubble floating around inside is the spirit gauge for measuring how strong the spirit energy is around the castle. The closer to the left, the weaker the spirits are, and the closer to the right, the stronger they are. This is technically a type of time limit, since if the spirits max out their strength, the game immediately ends, but it takes an extremely long time for the gauge to get that high. So unless you're playing the game incredibly badly, you'll probably never see this happen. Each time you defeat a spirit, the gauge moves closer to the left. The other important thing to keep track of are your keys near the bottom left corner. And there's 10 keys in the game in total, which are used to open various doors and chests as you progress through. Needless to say, one of the main goals in order to reach the end of the game is to acquire all 10 keys, and the sooner you can do this, the easier it'll be to get around the castle. Actually, finding your way around in this game may seem pretty straightforward, but you're going to get stuck more than once because some of the places you need to go and items you need to recover are hidden in some of the craziest places. And I'm going to give you guys one example which took me forever to figure out. There's a room with a shelving unit in it, and an item you want to get on the second shelf, which is too high to reach normally. There's various objects scattered around the room you can step on, but none of them are close enough to reach this item on the shelves. To get this item, you have to crawl onto the bottom shelf, go to the very back where you'll notice the second shelf doesn't actually reach all the way back, then stand up while on the lower shelf using what little room is back there so you can see above the second shelf and be close enough to reach the item in question. Puzzles like this are the norm in this game, so you need to get used to analyzing the heck out of every situation. Almost every room in this game serves a purpose of some kind, even if it doesn't seem immediately obvious, or even if the ultimate goal of the room is nothing more than food or treasure. The treasures in this game are worth extra points, but you don't need to find them to win. There's also a set of 10 pentacles you need to watch out for, as you need all 10 of them to open the vault you come across earlier on. Fortunately, the game does show you a little mercy in the way of hints scattered around on various signs throughout the castle. However, these hints are often very cryptic and often don't help all that much. The game is also incredibly lenient as far as combat is concerned, so if you enter battle with a spirit, just hold the rock throwing button down and move the cursor around until you finally hit the spirit in question. If you can't see it, move around a bit, as some spirits can only be seen from a single side. But most importantly, don't panic. With the exception of a single room later in the game, the spirits can't do much damage, so just because you've entered combat doesn't mean you don't have plenty of time to react. There's plenty of instant death traps scattered around the castle too, including pits which you can't escape from and slowly whittle your strength away as you stay stuck in them. So you'll want to keep saves going each time you enter a new room. Thankfully, most traps are avoided easily enough, with a couple exceptions, such as this beam which moves back and forth can be difficult to get by, at least until you remember that you can run in this game. Or unless you have the rock teleportation ability, you can just shoot the door on the other side. As for exploring the environment and finding everything, the biggest tips I have all come down to taking absolutely nothing for granted. For instance, just because you shoot something and nothing happens, doesn't mean you can't shoot it again and again. Likewise, just because you shoot something and there's a reaction, doesn't mean shooting it again and again won't have any effect. You'll also find some objects need to be physically pushed with your body, as opposed to using the button to interact, while other times you'll need to climb onto or into various objects to find certain things or to reach certain areas. Though, one other important tip I have is to pay attention to any black you see. Black is the color used for passageways to do sections, so anytime you see a large black area you can walk or crawl into, there's a good chance you can actually pass through it. One of the early spots like this is the larder behind the cooking equipment in the kitchen, though there's several other such spots too. You'll also want to make a note of any black spots you see in the ceilings, since oftentimes this will indicate that there's a way into that area of a room from right above it, provided it doesn't immediately fall into another black spot. Yeah, not a very long episode today. Overall, Castlememaster is hugely nostalgic for its early 3D graphics, utilizing extremely low polygon counts, and even now, the exploration aspect of this game is surprisingly fun, as there's lots of places to find throughout the castle, each one unique in some way. This sets it apart from games like Echelon, which was also dependent on exploring a large world of primitive 3D shapes, but Echelon had a ton of repetition and nothing to really interact with, which is why Castlememaster is the superior game, and is still playable even today. The only catch is that Castlememaster is a one-shot game, for the most part. Once you know how to win and once you know where everything is, then there's very little point to playing it over again. Except maybe just to speedrun it to see how quickly you can beat it. Well, it took me around 5 hours to beat the game. A lot of that was spent just trying to figure out what I missed, given how incredibly well hidden some things are. And thus, once you know where to find everything, you'd probably beat the game in around half an hour. As for DOSBox settings, just leave cycle set to auto and you're good to go. There's also joystick support, but I have no idea how it works because, quite frankly, you definitely want to be using the mouse and keyboard controls to play this game, since the mouse controls will more easily allow you to click on the things you can see, whereas with strictly keyboard or joystick controls, you have to switch between movement and cursor modes in order to do the same, and doing this is incredibly clunky. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week's a filler, and I have a few ideas for what I want to do, but I'm not totally set on anything yet. So make sure you stay tuned for next Saturday to see what I come up with.